Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised.
Russia can continue to sell its commodities to the world, then it's not going to be in serious risk economically. So in that environment, Russia's saying, yeah, we can sit back and let the political will in the West die.
Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This podcast is produced and hosted by Chris Carr.
On today's podcast, we're joined by Matthew Orr, who is a Eurasian analyst at RANE, which stands for Risk, Assistance, Network and Exchange. In this episode, we take a look at the first anniversary of Russia's war in Ukraine. Please note this episode was recorded just before the first anniversary of Russia's war on Ukraine. Unfortunately, it was delayed because I was ill, but there are many interesting points in this episode that still stand, so please do give it a listen, and I hope you find it interesting. Thank you very much for listening. Take care.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Matthew, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, Chris, it's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you back on. For the benefit of maybe new listeners, please can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm a Eurasia analyst at RANE, which stands for Risk, Assessment, Network and Exchange, and I cover basically a whole broad spectrum of risks related to the Eurasia region, so political risk, economic, geopolitical, you name it. So yeah, I basically follow events out in the region and try to inform our clients and our readers about them.
We're approaching the terrible first anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I was wondering if you had any kind of overarching thoughts as we approach this anniversary.
Yeah, as we approach this anniversary, I obviously recall this time last year, and I remember coming on your podcast a couple months ago and talking about some of these issues, but right. I mean, the reasons why we didn't think that the full-scale invasion was the most likely scenario have essentially borne out, right? Russia's invasion plan, as threatened, we didn't think it was going to work, and it clearly did not work, go according to plan. And now, Russia has really mired itself in this conflict by objective standards. This is really not even comparable to similar conflicts that Russia has been in since World War II, right? The comparison that comes to mind is the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, but there we're only talking about a couple tens of thousands of casualties, and that was for the whole Soviet Union, right? With its population of well over 300 million. Now we're talking about a much smaller Russia taking many more casualties. So this is just such the scale of this event is really not even comparable, and it doesn't look like this has really been in Russia's strategic interests. The only prize, in my estimation, for the whole invasion that Russia is clinging to is this Ukrainian territory, and not all of the Ukrainian territory that it's claimed since the invasion. Specifically, this land corridor to Crimea, the land bridge to Crimea, as it's sometimes called. The incremental small territorial gains that Russia has made further east in the Donbass are of little importance to the Russian people or Russia's political leadership, because these were, economically depressed towns and areas for a long time. And while, they provided an ideological justification for the war to help, patriotically justify it, really the only strategic prize has been this land corridor to Crimea, and now that corridor is under target and under threat. Right now, I don't think that the corridor is at risk of being imminently retaken by the Ukrainians. Obviously, that's going to be the Ukrainians' goal this year. But to me, it looks doubtful that the Ukrainians will retake it. And so that allows Russia to kind of cling to this extremely minimalist justification, or calling its war a victory. And so I think that's why, for now, political stability is going to be maintained in Russia, because the Russian people and elites will continue to believe that that the invasion was still worth the cost. So that's kind of where we are a year from now.
Yeah, well, as of today of our recording, Putin just gave quite a lengthy speech about his sort of motivations and feelings about the war. I don't know if you have any thoughts on Putin's sort of speech that's just happened.
Yeah, I do. So there was two things that I really found notable about it. He returned at the very beginning of the speech. He kind of returned to a more maximalist rhetoric about the purposes of the invasion. We've seen that throughout the invasion, he's fluctuated with all kinds of explanations and justifications for the war. At the very beginning, we all remember the famous demilitarization and denazification, which was essentially a threat of regime change. And now in this speech, he's kind of returned to that, where he basically indicated that replacing the regime in Kiev was one of the goals of the war. But that Russia hadn't really been leaning into that rhetoric for months now. Later it became about liberating the Donbass. Then he even made comments that, well, look, we've already achieved our strategic objectives because we've started, becoming more sovereign, as he would say, and becoming less dependent on the West. So then he's almost decoupling actual results of the territorial gains or anything. He's just saying, oh, we've already won the invasion because we're decoupling from the West or whatever. But now it seems that he's kind of that was unpopular in Russia, and so I think that this return to maximalist rhetoric is mainly just about domestic politics. I don't think it's that he can actually achieve a regime change in Kiev in the foreseeable future, and so that's what I think that's really about. And then, of course, the other big announcement in the speech was that Russia is leaving the New START treaty, the last major arms control treaty with the United States. Obviously, this is a big deal because this is the end of arms control as we know it since the 1960s, since the Cold War era. And it's unclear exactly how things are going to develop further from here. The treaty didn't have any. Putin said that they were suspending their participation. Well, the treaty doesn't have anything about suspending participation, so essentially they're leaving the treaty. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to start openly and grossly violating the treaty by deploying more nuclear warheads or delivery systems than they're supposed to, etc. But yeah, it opens the door for Russia to start secretly violating the treaty. And I think that the real goal of him announcing this is basically just a furthering of Russia's pre-war and previous rhetoric about arms control, which is that Russia wanted to use arms control as a mechanism to prompt a larger security dialogue with the United States and to a lesser extent the West in order to exchange concessions to the U.S. in arms control as they conceive them, in exchange for Western concessions vis-a-vis Ukraine, U.S. concessions vis-a-vis Ukraine. And of course, the Americans were like, no, we've never tied arms control to like other things. Of course, we're not going to try, tie arms control to Ukraine, which is an unrelated topic, etc. And this is about a whole big political gambit to do that, to try to force a broader dialogue in which arms control and Ukraine are essentially made as part of the same negotiation.
Is there a danger or an increased danger that now Russia might start giving nuclear technology to some of their, should we say, unsavory allies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that threat has definitely risen since the invasion. Obviously, at the top of the list is Iran that we're watching for. There's speculation on this. I tend to think that if Russia had done something like that, it would have been on the front page of the Washington Post, as we say, because that's information that like U.S. intelligence services would have leaked immediately. So I tend to think that Russia hasn't done that yet. The strategic reasons why Russia wouldn't provide nuclear technology to Iran is that would be very destabilizing to the Middle East region, as regional analysts would know, and it would anger a lot of Russia's own allies, the countries that Central Asia that are close to Iran. Azerbaijan, first and foremost Turkey, this country that Putin has put so much efforts into trying to maintain a close cooperative relationship with Turkey, that the Turks would not like that with all Saudi Arabia, the UAE, etc. So there's a whole long list of countries that would not like this. And for me, it seems that Russia strategically calculated that this is not in their interest at this time. But look, there's public reporting that this is something the Iranians have asked for. They've asked for in exchange for all the drones and other ballistic missiles that Iran is giving Russia to help the war in Ukraine. The Iranians would love help on nuclear technology, and so it's definitely something that the Russians are considering. But right now it looks like they're resisting that, and I tend to think that they will continue to for some time. But I totally recognize that it's a very real possibility.
Yeah, indeed. So on Monday, we had President Joe Biden make a historic visit to Ukraine. Can you talk to us about what this may mean for the war going ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, it's a pretty remarkable historic visit, right? The U.S. president visiting a country, in an active, full-scale war with, a country that's often recognized as a superpower, right? Given the context of all these events, a lot of people have already drawn comparisons to President Kennedy's, visit to Berlin during the crisis there. And so, I think this is definitely a visit that, is going to be for the history books. I think the problem is that, despite the visit's intention is to signal the U.S.'s long-term willingness to support Ukraine and presumably some confidence in the effect that our support, is going to have in the long term, right? Because it would be embarrassing for a U.S. president to visit Kiev and then, a couple of years later, then there's another, a different government there, or Putin's won the war, etc. The problem, the very obvious constraint on all that is that we all know that as in other countries, U.S. policy fluctuates, and we've already, if you follow U.S. politics, you see that the rhetoric around the war in Ukraine is a lot of this don't escalate, this kind of very war fatigue friendly narratives that, we need to be spending more money at home or on countering China. A lot of that is just to attack Biden just for easy domestic political points, and so it might not be reflective of actual Republican policy. But on the other hand, it's pretty clear that the Republican Party is much less supportive of the U.S.'s support for Ukraine, and so look, it's quite conceivable that a new not only a new U.S. president from the Republican Party or just changes in Congress could result in less military support for Ukraine, and that would be disastrous for Ukraine, and might mean that Russia wouldn't actually be dealt the strategic defeat that it's on the verge of receiving, and could actually claw victory from the jaws of defeat. So that's why it's still way, way, way too early to cast the die on how this is all going to shake out politically. And so it's a notable visit for the history books, but whether it results in the things that it presumably seems to be hinting at, it is still up for debate.
And we had the Munich Security Conference last week as well. Are there any kind of key takeaways you think that will have an impact on the war in Ukraine?
Yeah. For me, well, first off, a general point about the conference is that we all know that the biggest results of that conference in particular are not necessarily the things said from the stage. It's, you have all of these experts having all of these meetings, including small private conversations, and there could be some agreements and developments and discussions that don't get publicly reported on that are still significant. For me, the biggest thing that was reported publicly was the stuff related to the U.S. Secretary of State Blinken warning his Chinese counterpart about the risks of providing increased military support for Russia, which he said essentially China would seek to do secretly. That makes perfect sense because it's very much in China's interest to make sure that this war continues going on. That's because it's the best way to draw Western resources, European, American resources that otherwise would be spent on doing things like countering China, are instead spent somewhere else. And then secondly, the continuation of the war makes Russia more dependent on China and increases China's negotiating leverage over Moscow, and essentially has started reducing Moscow to vassal status to China. Russia is entirely dependent on China for key imports and exports. If Russia could not export what it exports to China, it would be an economically grave situation. If Russia could not import what it imports from China, Russia would be in economic collapse. So this just makes Russia even more dependent on China. And so that's why I think a really big risk to flag for everybody right now is that, I think the Chinese are looking at this and saying, we are motivated to secretly provide military support for Russia. Russia, needs artillery ammunition now. Russia needs electronics now. It would want missiles now. And if, the relationship is as close as a lot of, the Chinese and the Russians let on, I'm sure that the first thing the Russians are asking for are, provide greater military support. And the Chinese say, oh, we would love to, but we have to do it secretly so as to not put our own economy at risk of sanctions, which would be damaging to us. But at the end of the day, they say, would that mean that's a big risk and we're going to do everything to avoid it? But it's really in our strategic interest to support Russia. And so I think that they are going to come to that determination. And then it's going to come down to how hard does the U.S. get with these sanctions that it's threatened? I mean, it came out in an interview that President Biden gave recently that he'd essentially threatened Xi with the end of Western investment in China. He said he would attempt to organize, slowdowns of Western investment in China if China militarily supported Russia. And now we're creeping towards that. So this decoupling of the West from China that's been talked about as something, an ongoing process that's long down the road, it could start increasing pace, I think maybe faster than people are anticipating right now.
I must admit, I don't know why I thought it was stupid. I didn't even consider the Chinese angle on things there. That's really, truly fascinating, actually. So you feel then, China might try and prolong this war just so they can kind of benefit from it in many respects.
Yeah, I mean, I do kind of think, and that's why I so skeptically, related. There's also this talk of a Chinese peace plan, right? There's no reason to believe that a Chinese peace plan will make any meaningful contribution to the current negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, or a peace deal or anything like that. The Chinese want a deal that supports what Russia's already done, and we know that within China, only Russian narratives about the war are accepted. Something I've kind of been following closely as a kind of a pet project, if you will, is in cooperation with our China analyst, is are Ukrainian narratives penetrating within China at all? Or is it all getting shut down by Chinese censors? And the answer is that the Chinese censors, amongst all the other domestic China, all the things that they need to censor, the fact that they would go to such probity and care to make sure that pro-Ukrainian narratives are not penetrating into China, I think is notable, because otherwise you would have Chinese people, regular people, let alone party members, others questioning, is our support for Russia really in our strategic interests? Would it be better to stick up for the principles in the UN Charter and territorial integrity? Because territorial integrity is what we care a lot about, because that's how we are upper hand in the Taiwan situation, etc. But it doesn't look like the Ukrainian narratives are really penetrating within China. And so that means that Chinese support for Russia's policy is going to remain strong within the party, amongst the Chinese people, etc.
I have a couple of friends who are based in China who are connected to me on Facebook, and so I'm assuming that any pro-Ukrainian posts I've ever put up don't make it into their feed. Is that right?
I would presume so. The biggest thing that kind of happened on this front is the Chinese allowed the Ukrainian foreign minister to post one op-ed about a month into the war in a major Chinese newspaper. But that was really the only chance that the Ukrainians got to make their case to the Chinese people. Otherwise, China has a policy of just ignoring Ukraine, acting like it doesn't exist, which did not used to be China's policy toward Ukraine. Actually, Ukraine used to be part of infrastructure initiatives and bringing Chinese goods to the West and things like that. And the Chinese never recognized the annexation of Crimea, for example. So they could have been much closer and were not. But right now we're seeing this Chinese policy of basically ignore Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much for that. So when we last spoke, we were talking about kind of the how the winter was going to impact the war in Ukraine. So I suppose the first kind of question around all that is, what is the current situation on the ground? And then how do you feel this war is going to kind of progress over the spring ahead?
Yeah, the situation on the ground is that of this Russian winter offensive that the Ukrainians warned of, it probably began 3 or 4 weeks ago. It began when Russia began these attacks really along most of the front in Ukraine right now. The main two areas were around this city of Vuhledar in the south. This is southern Donbass. This is actually the closest point between Ukrainian-held territory and the Sea of Azov. So it would make sense that the Russians would attack there. And then the other main kind of thrust was by the city of Kremenna, which is up in farther north. And then of course there was this continued Russian effort toward Bakhmut. That's actually a slightly separate thing that's related to the Wagner Group and Yevgeny Prigozhin. And basically, my guess is that Prigozhin made some big promises either to the Ministry of Defense or to Putin himself about, oh, we're going to take this city or we're going to keep doing this and this is how we're going to prove Wagner's worth, etc., particularly in an environment where the Ministry of Defense, the regular Russian army, was saying, no, we're not going to do any attacks. We're going to sit back, prepare for a future offensive, prepare for Ukraine's own offensive, etc. And Wagner was kind of the only one saying, no, we want to try to maintain the initiative. So they said yes, but those Wagner attacks still haven't seized the city. They've taken major casualties, and that's ongoing with this current offensive. The goal of Russian offensives is to take as much territory as they can in the Donbass to get closer to that political objective of seizing this territory. And they would like to do all of that before a lot of these Western weapons start arriving in Ukraine, continue to move the front line forward, and then dig in deeper only once they've moved the front line forward. I mean, the bottom line is that the land bridge to Crimea is still very vulnerable, and so Russia's motivated to keep moving the front line in. That is the winter offensive. I mean, some Western press reports were kind of, there was all this talk of Belarus and new axes. And it doesn't look like anything like that is going to take place. The slightly more likely opening of a second front would be around the city of Kharkiv, I think, but it's still relatively unlikely because it would essentially amount to Russia throwing a lot of these newly mobilized, poorly trained, poorly equipped soldiers into an offensive towards a city that the Russian regular army that had been training for this couldn't achieve. And so I'm doubtful. I think that Russia's going to, pour more resources into what it's doing now and then sit back and say, okay, we did what we could, and then now we're going to sit back and prepare for Ukraine's offensive, which is going to come later in the spring.
So the UK is just sort of committed to supplying long-range weapons to Ukraine. And prior to this, we've had, obviously there's been a request by Zelensky for fighter jets. He gave a very historic speech just in Britain just a couple of weeks ago. And then we've had this sort of kind of, not drama, but a bit of a debate about tanks, and it's taken a while to sort of start getting tanks in. So I suppose with this commitment for long-range weapons and a potential, there hasn't been a commitment yet for jets that I know of, but there might be one soon. How likely is it that these weapons are going to kind of get to Ukraine, and how effective will they be in that?
Regarding the long-range weapons, I think that is really the most important weapon or capability that's being discussed right now. Ukraine needs those longer-range weapons to be able to strike deeper into areas that the Russians currently think are safe to position their equipment, their supply dumps, etc. And so that's the most significant thing. Also, an environment where Ukraine is attempting to strike southward, a lot of those ammunition dumps, logistics, all run through Crimea. So Ukraine would need to begin striking into Crimea, or at least cutting off the transport to and from Crimea to the land bridge. So that's why those long-range capabilities are important. And and it looks like Ukraine will receive those. As far as how much of them and when, it's all still very hazy. The UK has also said that they're going to be doing this long-range stuff. I think regarding the UK's long-range stuff, it's even hazier what systems they're literally even talking about. There's the current range of ammunition for the HIMARS system that Ukraine has received, the precision MLRS, and then the US has said that they're going to give this longer range GLSDB, which is about double the current range. The current range is something like 50 kilometers, if I'm not mistaken. Or is it? Yeah. No, sorry, 80-ish kilometers. And then the GLSDB would be like 160-ish kilometers, 150. And Ukraine really needs that. I mean, they hope to receive that. I'm not sure what the longer range capability the UK is hinting that they could provide. But yeah, I mean, this all remains to be seen. And it's not the long range capabilities that the Ukrainians want. There was a lot of talk about another system, ATACMS, which is 300 kilometers, even longer. It doesn't look like the U.S. is going to give that. It doesn't look like the U.S. is going to give permission for other countries to give it either. I think the U.K. may or may not have ATACMS. I can't remember. But it doesn't look like there's going to be a development there because presumably they're worried about Ukrainians using these weapons to not strike within Ukraine's internationally recognized border, but to strike into Russia. And that's something that they don't want. And that makes sense. The Ukrainians are highly motivated to strike deep within Russia. There's already been these Ukrainian strikes deep within Russia on Russia's strategic aviation, which Putin actually cited in his speech today as one of the reasons that Russia's leaving the arms control treaty, because he said, look, the Ukrainians using Western support are striking deep inside Russia. The Ukrainians are highly motivated to do that because the Ukrainians feel that's one of the only ways to really degrade support for the war within Russia. So they want to do that. They're just going to have to do that with their own capabilities, but that they make domestically. Regarding the fight, the jets, yeah, I mean, it looks like the jets are not going to make it to the front in time for you when Ukraine would like to do this offensive. I mean, the jets training takes weeks and weeks. Numbers have been thrown around. People have said like 4 months at the earliest, 3 months maybe if you really rush the whole thing. But again, it still all depends on the actual deliveries and then, the training for the specific jet, for the specific mission. So, like, for example, one of the things these Ukrainian jets or Western jets provided to Ukraine would be doing would be SEAD, right? So suppression of enemy air defenses. That's a whole other mission type that you need additional training for, etc. So, I mean, a lot of these numbers that have been thrown around have been kind of optimistic, and so I'm skeptical that we're really going to see these jets soon.
Yeah. Well, practically as well, like they're basically going to have to send out pilots to go and receive the training, and those pilots then won't be available to defend Ukraine during that time.
Yeah, that's true. Although what I will say is that, like, one of the reasons that I don't think these jets are really a priority or even needed for Ukraine's own offensive is that Ukraine is growing anti-air, ground-based anti-air capabilities. Really, both sides do. Both sides have pretty extensive anti-air, and it's growing. And that's why the Russians have been afraid to fly their own jets close to the front. They've been, dropping dumb bombs in very safe ways to keep their jets as far away from the front as possible. I mean, I think that speaks to itself that the Russians are scared of the anti-air capabilities the Ukrainians already have. And so, right, the jets would just be kind of all about securing Ukraine's long-term independent ability to secure its skies. I'm positive that Western jets will end up in Ukraine eventually. I mean, it's essentially 100% because the only alternative would be continuing to procure like older Soviet and Russian-made aircraft for Ukrainians, which just doesn't make a lot of sense given that Ukraine's switching to all these other Western and NATO standards, and it's not like the West has tons of actually these older. I mean, it's easier to get F-16s than these older, systems at this point because so many of them have already been used and destroyed, etc.
Yeah. Do Poland still have any? Was it Su-27s? I can't remember. I thought Poland had a bit of a stockpile of some Soviet or Russian jets at one time.
Yeah, they do. So there was Slovakia and Poland both have MiG-29s that they very early on offered up. There was a whole snafu with what the logistics of delivering them, and so it didn't happen at the time. But yeah, I mean, I think that's another kind of signpost for the Western jets being provided is they say, well, yeah, I mean, if we're going to provide these Western jets, we should also, as a preparatory step, we can also provide these older Soviet jets. And so, yeah, I think that's another step that we should look out for.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you very much for all that. One other thought as well is like about the missile defense. So do you think the Ukrainians will be getting anything like the Patriot system? And also, do you have any insight as to why Israel has not wanted to share its Iron Dome system, which would be a very good system in Ukraine, and any other lethal aid?
Yeah. I guess I'll start with the second one on Iron Dome. My understanding of why the Israelis don't provide Iron Dome is that there's a new government in Israel that your listeners may be aware of. This is the return to power of Benjamin Netanyahu. One of his signature foreign policy objectives pieces, which dates back to more than a decade ago, of one of his, since he's been an Israeli prime minister, has been closer relations with Russia. Maybe maintaining a close cooperative relationship to try to use that as Israel, conducts its policy in the Middle East. One of the big ways that this reflects itself is how the Israelis do all kinds of strikes within Syria, but Russia is the air force responsible for securing the skies over Syria, which is like essentially a client state of Russia at this point, right? But Israel does all kinds of strikes there, and so it needs to, it doesn't want its jets to be shot down by Russia. So there's kind of a kind of a constant deconfliction going on there, and more broadly, Benny Netanyahu really wanted Russia to be this country that would, help Israel with vis-a-vis Iran and vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia to a lesser extent and things like that, because it's hard for Israel to find other powerful allies that can, help it and apply pressure in certain negotiations. But now, right, given what we've been seeing, there's a lot of questioning of Israel. Was this whole policy, like, we're he's trying to be close with Russia, and all we see is Russia growing closer to Iran, and it hasn't really worked out. And so that's why the previous Israeli government that just left office several months ago, they had kind of been creeping towards greater support of Ukraine, but there was also not desire to kind of openly get involved, do their own sanctions, do their own weapons deliveries, etc. openly. And it looks like Netanyahu is trying to kind of go back to preserving relations with Russia. But the thing is that now public opinion in Israel is moving in a certain direction where Israelis are, the Russian foreign administrator, the Russian foreign minister has made strange anti-Semitic remarks on multiple occasions. A lot of the Israelis are kind of concerned about the state of anti-Semitism within Russia but basically kind of the trajectory of Russia's policy. And so now Netanyahu is kind of holding on to this policy, even as, the Israelis are less into it, and as strategically it's become clear that it's not doing a whole lot for Israel. And so that's why this discussion of Iron Dome is kind of coming once again to the fore. I don't think that they're going to supply anything like that. That's it's pretty advanced, and they want it. It's expensive. They want it for their own capabilities, etc. But it's a possibility, and I know that maybe the Ukrainian or maybe the Israelis are thinking what we could do more to covertly support Ukraine, particularly if now the Iranians are getting to test their drones in Ukraine, do all these things great for Iran there. Then maybe the Israelis could quietly change their policy. The key word being quietly. I think publicly Netanyahu is going to retain his previous policy, but quietly there could be a small change.
Any thoughts on why Netanyahu's sort of pursuing such a close relationship with Russia? Is it because he's concerned of declining American support in the future, or is it something more ideological? Do we know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that both of those two played a role in the beginning, but I think at this point a lot of it is just kind of an inertia, and it's always embarrassing. I mean, it would be. I mean, any other policy would be a recognition that his previous, like a huge pet project of his for the past 10+ years was a failure. So in a line where he can't, that can't be the policy, right? He's got to make it way more subtle, and so I think it'll be about we're gonna I think one of the first things the new foreign minister said when they came to power is we're going to be way more. We're going to speak a lot less about our policy about Ukraine and Russia. So they're kind of just saying that they're making the relationships a lot less hazier, and they're going to be less declarations about it. But I think essentially inertia is a big reason for it at this point.
Yeah, makes sense. One other story that's sort of come up recently is about sort of a lack of ammunition supplies, or a shortage of ammunition supplies for supplying Ukraine. I was wondering if you had any sort of insight into those supposed shortages.
So, right. The Ukrainians are desperately short of ammunition, artillery ammunition in particular. And I mean, the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, at the most recent Ramstein meeting of Ukraine's defense donors, said some pretty remarkable things about how these shortages are. He even called for artillery ammunition producers to increase shifts and work on weekends. Working on weekends is really something that, for civilian industries are more likely to consider only in a state of wartime, right? Because I mean, how you're going to provide the economic stimulus needed to pay workers to work weekend shifts is pretty big deal, and there's no indication that that's taken place. But the fact that he would even float that idea, I think, is indicative of how bad the shortages have become. And that's because, we've seen, so the U.S., for example, said we're going to increase our 155 millimeter artillery ammunition production sixfold, but by 2025. Well, Ukraine doesn't need artillery ammunition in 2025. It needs artillery ammunition months from now for its own offensive. And so, I mean, that's really kind of the worry that's sprung up, is that we're not seeing the orders and we're not seeing the evidence that the artillery ammunition is growing quickly enough for the Ukrainians. And so that's a very, very real concern in my mind. It goes the other way for the Russians. They don't have enough artillery ammunition. Even just recently, the Wagner Group is saying we're not getting enough artillery ammunition, etc. The thing, though, is that Russia is already starting from a much higher like continuation point. They're still using something like 3 to 4 times what Ukraine is using, and while they can't produce enough to replace what they're using, they can. It still appears that they can maintain a higher rate for longer than the Ukrainians can, and that just means that every day of the war, the Russians are firing more artillery ammunition, and that makes it harder to. That's just devastating for the other side. So that everything related to that topic is definitely very concerning in my mind.
Well, this is one of the concerns I always had. I felt like it appeared like Russia could still just because of the ammunition supplies and things kind of outgun Ukraine over a longer period of time and kind of grind them down. Being very general, Russian strategy appears to be a strategy of brute force most of the time, looking at sort of previous conflicts and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. They say that we have the manpower advantage, and we domestically produce our weapons, whereas the Ukrainians are dependent on the West for the deliveries of the ammunition they need to survive. So they think that with those two factors, they tend to think that's and then their economy is stable in the long term. That's the other really big thing. As long as Russia can export its oil, which is something like, it's 20% of GDP, I think 40% of the budget, almost 60% of exports historically. If Russia can continue to sell its commodities to the world, then it's not going to be in serious risk economically. So in that environment, Russia's saying, yeah, we can sit back and let the political will in the West die, and then we're going to basically get something good enough that we can easily call a victory. Unfortunately, that's my fear that we're the trajectory we're on, and so that's why I think that the West really does need to step up support. It does. We need to have President Biden tomorrow saying, I'm ordering our domestic artillery ammunition manufacturers to provide sufficient economic stimulus to keep those plants opening on the weekends. The same thing needs to happen in Europe, honestly, although I'm very skeptical that there's any political will for that in most of Europe, unfortunately. But those are the kind of more decisive steps we would really need to be seeing to have more confidence in kind of Ukraine's long-term ability, in my estimation.
Yeah, again, it's me sort of thinking aloud. It feels like this year is the crucial year for Ukraine, because I fear whatever the result of the next election in the US, I feel like, this time next year, I feel like it's going to be more contentious to support Ukraine than it is at the moment. I could be wrong in that assessment, but I feel like, if it kind of grinds on for too long, people are going to start to tire of it, or we're just not going to be able to supply them in the longer term. I could be wrong, but
yeah, exactly. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about Biden's visit to Kiev, right? He wants it to signal that the U.S. is right, that Russia is going to be dealt a strategic defeat because Western support isn't going to end. The problem is that if you follow statements made by members of the U.S. Republican Party, that they're really leaning into this rhetoric of we need to be spending the money that we're spending supporting Ukraine at home. Objectively, it's kind of ridiculous because the amounts that we're spending to support Ukraine are still just like a rounding error on our defense budget. But it's providing much more greater security than arguably the whole rest of the budget, because if Russia secures a victory in Ukraine, then all the rest of the budget is going to be towards resources to deal with the Russian threat and the Chinese threat from a position where they've become emboldened, objectively more powerful, etc. So it defies all logic, strategic logic, in my estimation. But it's a very, very easy political talking point in the United States and in Europe, essentially. And so, I think it's definitely concerning, but that's what's very encouraging to the Russians, right? They tend to think that, we just need to get a president from the other party in power in the United States, and then we're essentially going to get most of what we want. Of course, no U.S. politician is going to, frame it that way, but de facto, that's what's going to happen.
No, indeed. When we last spoke, we briefly touched upon the role of intelligence in the war, and I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about Ukrainian intelligence services, the SBU, and kind of what's known about their role in the war.
Well, we do know that there were some major, not surprising at all, that SBU was a bloated, way too large organization, successor organization to the KGB. Most European countries' domestic security services were not relatively as large as the SBU was. What that meant was that the SBU had a mandate that was too broad and large and had way too many employees and was way too leaky. And of course, when the invasion happened, there were high-level defections, traitors in the ranks of the SBU, particularly in southern and eastern Ukraine, and that was devastating to Ukraine. I mean, one of the biggest ways that reflected itself, I think, was in the opening war in southern Ukraine. So there's literally only two real ground entry points between Crimea and southern Ukraine. There are these tiny little isthmuses. Of course, any military strategy would involve heavily mining those entrances, and they were heavily mined. But of course, now one of the big topics of investigation within Ukraine is how did the Russians walk through those minefields like it was nothing? And it seems quite obvious that either someone from the SBU helped them remove the mines, or the mine maps were leaked to them. But everything related to that was very easy for the Russians to overcome, it appears. Same thing goes for even as they move further into southern Ukraine. How did they cross the Antonovsky Bridge across the Dnieper River into Kherson City intact? Numerous other bridges were destroyed, but the main road bridge across which almost large parts of the Russian army were able to cross somehow was that bridge that needed to be destroyed. It presumably should have been ordered to be destroyed. There was some speculation that maybe the Ukrainians deliberately left it so that they could destroy it later, so that they could trap the Russians over there, etc. I'm skeptical of that. The Ukrainians would have, the Ukrainians wouldn't want the Russians across the river in any case. They would want to keep as much of their territory. I mean, letting the Russians across the river is a very risky military strategy. I think that's doubtful. So I think in long story short, it's likely that treachery within the SBU was a major reason why that bridge was not destroyed. And then, there was this notable instance where I think, hundreds of Ukrainian bureaucrats, many of which were also SBU officials, are now under investigation and trial in Ukraine for treason. The good news now, though, is that, this has forced a lot of these people to put their cards on the table. And I think that a lot of people who, now there's all kinds of internal investigations, the SBU, and they had a change of leadership, and now they have a kind of a career person there as opposed to a crony or a long-time Zelensky associate who was mainly there for loyalty reasons as opposed to competence. And so, in general, I think that we can be more confident in the state of the SBU now, but it's still a very large, potentially problematic organization. But I think that they have been effective, though, at stopping a lot of more effective things that Russian intelligence could have done. I mean, everything from the Russians probably tried to kill Zelensky, in my estimation. That did not work. The SBU got Viktor Medvedchuk, this pro-Russian Ukrainian politician, who was then exchanged for a hugely disproportionate number of Ukrainian prisoners of war. That was actually a big win for them, because he had fled, he had been in an unknown location, and then for them to capture him and exchange him like that was really good for them. And then even more tactical things like, look, Russia has not been able to Russia is every day trying to destroy Western anti-air systems in Ukraine to make its campaign against civilian infrastructure more effective. That for some stuff like that, a lot of it you actually want on the ground people who are trying to figure out where these systems are hidden, and you can have human intelligence help with that. But the Russians aren't being particularly effective with that. So, there's a lot to suggest that, the SBU is still doing a lot of things that are important for helping Ukraine resist in the war.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you for that. There have been a few sort of sabotage operations, which I think we briefly touched upon earlier, that have had that have been kind of going on in deep in Russia. I was wondering if there's any information about who might be responsible for that.
Yeah, I think it's safe to assume that the SBU or its kind of foreign intelligence sister organization are involved in some of the explosions that we've seen. The main wave of them was back in April or May, if I'm not mistaken, but quite early in the war. Of course, we can't explain, all of them, and it seems quite doubtful that all of them, or maybe even a majority of them, are related to the SBU, but I think it's not. I think it's probably likely that some of those and some other more recent explosions could be related to the SBU, because I mean they have a large agent network that operates in Russia. It's relatively easy for them to operate in Russia, and they have no reason not to, right? Particularly they want at least to have those capabilities, to have that possibility to be a restraining factor on Russian conduct. So I continue to think that they of course had projects to use refugees to insert agents into Russia, etc. So presumably their pool of possible agents has even grown in recent weeks. Since the invasion, because Russia can't track all of the Ukrainian refugees who entered Russia. Of course, it documented them, sent them through these filtration camps, but it can't monitor them all at all times, etc. So yeah, no, I mean that's a very important capability to them, even for things like if the Russians do, for example, do conduct political assassinations against high-ranking Ukrainian officials, well, it's pretty clear that the Ukrainians want the Russians to know that you can't do that, because that would sanction us assassinating your officials within Russia, and that's definitely equally dangerous for the Russians themselves. So yeah, I mean they're going to continue those activities, but I don't anticipate kind of anything like that. But they have capabilities, and they're going to try to seek to maintain them.
Have those sort of sabotage operations had an effect on the Russian public's sort of view of the war?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent. If we talk about the big banner one, obviously the destruction of the Crimea land bridge. I don't know if that. Well, I mean, it doesn't matter exactly who it was. It was I guess SBU and the GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence organization. And when they blew up the Crimea land bridge, I mean, that was very embarrassing for Putin, the Russian government, etc. And it's obviously militarily devastating, because that bridge is used to facilitate civilian and military life in Crimea, and therefore the rest of occupied Ukraine. So I mean that those kinds of strikes are notable, and I mean it led to panic in Crimea, and it led to people trying to flee Crimea back to Russia, and it led to people saying, well, hold on, has the special military operation made us safer or less safe? And all of that is undermines narratives that the Kremlin has used, and so it's politically dangerous. But that's exactly also why the Ukrainians, having seen the effect of that bridge strike, their conclusion was, this gave us all the signs that we would have wanted. So we're still motivated to do that kind of sabotage.
Oh, thank you for that. Have you got any insight into how President Putin is holding up politically in Russia at the moment? Yeah,
I mean, the bottom line is that he's holding up, and his hold on power, remains secure. In his speech, he returned to these maximalist conceptions of victory in Ukraine, but he didn't. There wasn't this strong sign that he was considering a new mobilization, or like a reformatting of the special military operation into a war, or a cancellation of. There's supposed to be a presidential election in Russia a year from now. And he made it sound like I shouldn't even call it election. Election in quotation marks, and an electoral exercise is going to be conducted on schedule, as opposed to what some people had been saying, like, what election? We need a wartime exception. How can we conduct this stressful moment for the political system when it's very obvious what kind of predicament we're in? But it looks like he's not going for that approach, and he's going to look to conduct that election as scheduled, and use it to say, oh my gosh, look how popular I still am, look how much everybody supports me, whatever. So he's still, but that's notable just because it shows that he still tends to think that even this totally decorative electoral exercise is somehow useful and necessary and beneficial and needed for his political support in Russia. So I mean, you can draw that conclusion as well. But otherwise, the Russian people are intimidated. They've seen hundreds of thousands of their compatriots flee the country. They've seen tens of thousands of others imprisoned. I mean, there's some very notable cases where anti-war people are. I mean, Ilya Yashin did an op-ed in Time recently. He's in eight years in prison for opposing the war. Another Moscow local council deputy, similar sentence, I think 7 or 8 years for opposing the war. I mean, when you see the cost of 8 years in prison for opposing the war, I mean, that has a very chilling, intimidating effect, and that's what's keeping a lot of people who oppose the war, are doing, they're telling their friends about it. They may not hide their position, but they're not going to take any action that puts themselves at risk. And so I think that he can keep some political stability for that reason.
Yeah, indeed. And are we in any increased danger, especially now at the end of the New START treaty, are we in any increased danger of this war sort of spiraling out of control and leading to some sort of nuclear confrontation with Russia?
I tend to still not think so. If we look at the strategic situation, I don't think Russia wants an arms race. I don't think it's going to openly violate the main provisions of the treaty. But yeah, I mean, look, overall, Russia, is still going to continue to use nuclear blackmail, and leaving the treaty as part of those vague nuclear blackmail efforts. And yeah, how Russia would use nukes is it would use tactical nukes. I think, to strike the Ukrainian armed forces as a warning to say, look, I mean, if you keep supporting Ukraine, we're going to drop another one and another one and another one, because the Ukrainians would not give up after the first tactical nuke use, is my estimation. I don't think that, it's something the Russians do not want to do. I'm reminded of the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, back in like May or April, many months ago, said, we're actually surprised that Russia has not engaged in more nuclear blackmail than some of our more likely scenarios would have anticipated. I think the reason for that is that the Russians have calculated that engaging in more hardcore nuclear blackmail is not necessarily in their interest, are going to work out well for them. And right, if you engage in more open attempts at it, and then it doesn't lead to the Western change in opinion, then that means that you actually have to follow up on your threat and use nukes, and that's not something that Russia wants to do, because that's how you can look at China and India and these major backers. The leaders of those countries and even their populations would be kind of rolling their eyes and reassessing their kind of even loose rhetorical alignment with Russia. So it's not necessarily good for Russia. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't think that we're necessarily going to see that. I think that's not going to come into play until, if the Ukrainians retake the land corridor and Putin feels that there's a real risk to Crimea, because then Crimea is for Putin this jewel and this strategically important territory for him. And I think that he probably would try to draw a nuclear red line on Crimea. But the thing is, I don't think that the Ukrainians are even considering militarily retaking Crimea, because it's not feasible, because there's only those two ways into Crimea, and I don't think that they can really militarily retake it.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Do you think we're any closer to really seeing a Ukrainian victory this year?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of spoke about this a bit earlier. Look, Ukrainian victory is retaking the land bridge. It doesn't look to me that they're getting the weapons quickly enough and in large enough quantities that they would need to do that, unfortunately. And without the corridor, it becomes much harder for Ukraine to hope for political change in Russia to change things. The Ukrainians are fine to sit back and play defensive too. Not that they think that they're particularly advantaged in that vis-a-vis Russia, but just because it's really their only other option. But the thing is that they really need the corridor to have a reasonable hope of political change in Russia. Otherwise, them sitting back would just involve Putin being able to conduct a power transfer at his leisure, and a very similar imperialist, fascist, essentially Russian government to remain in power. I guess I took your question too strategically, but unfortunately, no, I'm very concerned that we're not seeing the things for Ukraine to win this year. I mean, it needs a lot. It needs a manpower advantage. It honestly needs more mobilization. It's done a little bit more mobilization. I think the best estimates are that it has about 700,000 mobilized personnel. As you know, for attacking forces in a war, you want to have at least 2-to-1, preferably 3-to-1 localized. You really want to have a pretty big advantage. And it doesn't look like Ukraine really has a very big manpower advantage, let alone the weapons that it needs. So, yeah, I think we're in a really dangerous phase, and I really hope that the West can really step up and provide more sooner.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Any final thoughts before we part ways today?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that, it's, a lot of this is dependent on us. Putin still tends to think that the kind of political support is going to wane in the West. But I think that if people in the West kind of had a clearer sense of what's actually taking place and what's actually at stake, then there might be more willingness to maintain the current support for Ukraine. In my estimation, we have seen a public polling suggest that there's been a decline in a willingness to support Ukraine. But I mean, I think a lot of that might be, related to the fact that the West isn't stepping up. Western politicians aren't stepping up as much as needed. So what we do know is that people are more likely to support Ukraine when they believe that Ukraine can actually win. And so what I also want to say is that Ukraine still actually can win this. They just need that support. So I mean, we just need to pressure our politicians to let them know that, hey, I mean, this is in our interest and we need to act sooner rather than later. And 2024, 2025 is really not good enough.
No, indeed. Well, Matthew, thank you for your time today. Where can listeners find out more about you and your work?
So you can find my work on RANE.com, Risk Assessment Network and Exchange, and also on our website, our former website, Stratfor, where a lot of our articles are available for anyone can subscribe and read our articles there as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for joining me today.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.